Well, today, I want you to take out the rubbish. I want you to get rid of the garbage. I want you to throw away those things that are unhealthy in your life. Now, they could be physical things, they could be emotional things, they could be mental things, they could be spiritual things. I don't know what it is, but I think that in life, we all accumulate a bunch of garbage. And we carry it along with us. We put it over our shoulder in a rubbish bag and we just carry it along. And so I want to continue a message that we started last week. And it's called Clear the Clutter. Because there are things that we are carrying around in that rubbish bag that are unhealthy. What they're actually doing is they're being unhealthy for us. But more than that, they actually affect our relationship with Jesus because they impact how we look at ourselves, they impact how we look at others, and most importantly, they impact how we see God as our Abba Father. And so I want to continue looking at this thought around clear the clutter. So it is part 2 of a message. So I'll give you just a brief summary, as brief as I can be, when it comes to what we covered last week. So last week we actually looked at physical clutter and the issue that it can be, and more than that, what God actually had to say when it comes to physical clutter. And we saw that stuff in our lives actually matters. It actually matters, and it's not so much the stuff, but it's what the stuff represents. So if the stuff is an idol, if the stuff is masking hurt or it's hiding pain, things along those lines, then the stuff is a problem. But sometimes the stuff is actually prevents things in us. So sometimes we're actually wasting money on things we don't need, so we don't actually have money for the things that are important. Things along those lines. Sometimes it's robbing us of peace and harmony. Sometimes it's the time. We're wasting time when we could be furthering the kingdom, but we're wasting time on these earthly things. And that's when it creates a problem. So last time we looked at a passage from Luke 12. It was all about this rich man. He'd been blessed with an abundance of crops. The problem he had was, though, his barns weren't big enough for the abundance of crops. And rather than displaying generosity and actually transforming his community by sharing his crops, this rich man decided, I'm going to tear down my perfectly good barns and I'm going to build some bigger and better barns that will store all of the excess that God has blessed me with. But God made it very clear that wasn't a good plan. This man would have been celebrated on earth. Men and women all around would have said, you're very wise, you're doing a fantastic thing. But God actually said to him, you're a fool. You're a fool. And it all came down not to the stuff, but it all came down to the rich man's lack of trust in God being his source and his provider. The rich man said, I've got my own plan, so I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and I'm going to push God to the side. I'll follow my plan and not put my trust in God. And we sort of finished last week, and we acknowledged that there's a difficulty in freeing ourselves from physical clutter. When that's an issue for us, it's actually a metaphorical difficulty in clearing spiritual clutter in our lives. So if we've got clutter in one area, generally it will filter out into other areas. So that's where we're going to head today. But before we do that, can I just say a couple of things after last week's message? I chatted to a couple of people after service and even during the week. And they said, thank you for speaking into that. I found it really helpful. I found it really beneficial. And I don't necessarily, it's nice, when people go, nice message, Pastor, I appreciate that. But, I just follow the leading of the Holy Spirit and I speak out what he wants me to speak out. But it's encouraging to know that God is speaking to you through the words that he asked me to share. Now, can I just say this of last week's message? I was very uncomfortable about last week's message. I was almost at a point where I was like, I don't know if I want to speak this. I don't know if this is a message that I actually want to share. But as I said, I did that in obedience, and I'm very thankful that he's really been reaching some people through it. And I've been given permission to share this, so don't look poorly upon me because I'm speaking this to you. But we talked last week, and I mentioned out of Matthew 6:19, which is, a great verse that tells us, don't store up the riches of this world, where it's going to be destroyed, where thieves will break through and steal it, where moth and rust and worm will consume it. And afterwards, Brendan and Diari came up and spoke to me, and they said, hey, Pastor, that really spoke to us, that message. Because here's the thing, our house was full, so we put all the extra stuff into the garage. But the garage got full, so then we put the extra stuff into a shipping container, which is on their yard. But here's the funny thing. They then said, we went through the shipping container, and it wasn't moths, but it was cockroaches had destroyed some of the stuff in their shipping container. So it was like, there's that verse right here in 2022 in Southern Lake Macquarie. And I thank you so much for allowing me to share it this morning, guys. So, if you've got a shipping container, don't store a whole bunch of stuff in there, because Matthew 6:19 is going to happen. Maybe it's not moths, but maybe it's cockroaches. But at the end of last week's message, I said that there is a direct correlation between physical clutter and spiritual clutter in our lives. And that's why we looked at it last week, and that's why we looked at what the Bible said, and that's why our focus today is going to be on that spiritual clutter. What is spiritual clutter? What does it actually look like when it comes to our lives and our walk with Jesus? Hebrews 12:1 tells us this: throw off everything that stands in our way. Everything that stands in our way. Let us throw off any sin that holds on to us so tightly. So what does that mean when it says everything? In some versions, it'll say every weight. So it's talking about everything that clutters up our lives and creates distance between us and Jesus. Anything that does that is a distraction from us finding and continuing to find and walking with Jesus. So when I talk about spiritual clutter today, it's really those distractions that constantly compete for our attention. Anything that is competing for our attention is distracting us from our walk with Jesus. That's what we mean by spiritual clutter. Some of them are easy to spot. Some of them you can go, yep, I know that's an issue, I'm working on that. God's working on me. But some of them are a lot more subtle. And we're not going to have time to go through all of them today. Otherwise, we would be here for a long, long time. So I'm just going to sort of cherry pick some of them. But here's why spiritual clutter is dangerous. It can actually rob you of the ability, when you try and spend time in God's Word, it can rob you of hearing the voice of God through His Word. Because you're distracted. You're thinking about something else. And you're not encountering God through His Word. It can draw you away from Jesus. Before you know it, you've drifted. And it can imprison you behind bars, and things like anger and bitterness or hatred or unforgiveness. All of those things can rise up to the top when we don't deal with spiritual clutter. So I want to look at a couple of types of spiritual clutter. And then I want to give you just a couple of tools that hopefully can help you overcome when it comes to spiritual clutter. It's not an exhaustive list. There's many, many more. And so I'm going to give you some homework today and ask you this week to spend time with God and have Him illuminate the clutter, the spiritual clutter that you've been carrying around in a bag that He wants you to get rid of. And then I'll be marking your test next week. Or maybe not. So from the outset, I want to remind you that you might hide something from yourself or others, but you're not hiding it from God. So just be honest with him. He loves it when we're open and honest, when we let our guard down, when we say, Abba, Father, I'm struggling with this. Abba, Father, I'm challenged by that. Just let it down. Let the guard down. There is freedom when we let the guard down and we let God in. That's when we get free of spiritual clutter in our lives. And don't pretend that it doesn't exist. You've got it. I've got it. We've all got it. We just do. We accumulate it as we go through life, as we journey through life. And just last week, I was talking to someone after church, and they were saying, they've been having a really strong battle recently with mental health. And I was saying, how are you going? They said, yeah, I'm in a really good place at the moment because I've realized that there's a bunch of stuff from before that I've just pushed down and pushed down and pushed down and haven't addressed and haven't got free of. And so it's been weighing me down, and it's got me to the point where the clutter, the spiritual clutter that I've been carrying around has been unhealthy for me. Don't get to that place where sometimes it's too late. All right. So, a couple of things for you. The first of those is a lack of space. So one aspect of spiritual clutter is a lack of space. Now, when we jam-pack everything in and we don't leave any space, if it's our house or our garage, that's when our house is full to overflowing. And we go to the garage, and then in the extreme, we go to a shipping container. But we can do the same thing when it comes to us spiritually. We take every tiny section, and eventually we can get to the point where we've left no room for anything new. Now, I know, and I hope that you do, that God is a God of new things, that he loves new things. He always wants us to be growing. He wants us to be experiencing his new things. But if we've just jam-packed and there's a lack of space and there's no space for anything new, then that is a problem. And I remember early in our marriage, January 16, 1995, Jackie and I, we headed to America for the first time, and it was our first trip there. And this was pre-online shopping and the rise of online shopping and stuff. And so we got to California, and I remember us seeing like the outlet stores that they had, and like the dollar was at a good amount, and everything was so cheap. And so we were like, we got to take advantage of this. It was just the two of us. We didn't have kids. We were both working, getting decent income. The problem was we bought so much stuff that when it came time to come back to Australia, we had a problem. The problem was we'd already packed everything we needed and more before we left Australia, so our suitcase was already stuffed full. But then we got these new things, and so the night before we're about to jump on the plane, we open up the suitcase, and you do the thing, you squash everything down, then you try and close it up and squash it down. And we got to the point where we went, it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. We're going to have to buy another suitcase. That's exactly what we did. We went out and bought a new suitcase, so all the stuff that we bought could be brought back home to Australia. Now, I would like to tell you that this was a one-time occurrence, that we learnt our lesson after this first trip. But no, the next couple of times that we went travelling, we did exactly the same thing. We stuffed our suitcase so much from the outset that we had no more space. There was a lack of space for anything new that we wanted to add into it. And so we've got several suitcases in our garage that are a testament to that. Suitcases we didn't need, suitcases that have done one trip from Los Angeles back to Sydney, and that's all that they've done, but the purpose they served was to carry all of the extra stuff that we had accumulated. Let's not be like that when it comes to what we're carrying around. let's not stuff things so very much with all of the baggage that we're carrying from the years gone past that there's no room for God to do what he wants to do and for the new things that he wants to bring into our lives. Doesn't matter how old you are, God is a God of new things. We can't go and get another spirit from the shop and carry that with the one that we have, like a suitcase or anything like that. Often we pack so much into the days that we have, or, trying to store up all these treasures of the world to have the abundance of crops like the rich man from Luke 12. Often we try and do that so much, but we don't have space for those new things. And here's what I think can happen. A lack of space can often lead to a lack of grace. When we lack the space for God to do what he wants to do, it can outwork in you and me as a lack of grace to those that are around us. Particularly those that aren't Christians. And so what does it do when it comes to how they see our Abba Father? It paints a poor picture of him. Let's not be that church. Let's not be those people. And so we see this in the rich man from Luke 12. He had all this fertile ground, which had allowed him to have this abundance of crops. But the problem was not the crops. The crops were the blessing from God. It was the attitude that was behind the crops, the abundance, and how it impacted this man's relationship with God. He became reliant upon his own works, upon his own effort, as opposed to relying upon the Lord to be his source. He filled up his spiritual space, chasing the riches of the world. He had no space left for what God wanted to actually do in his life. And we saw this in Luke 12:21. He'd forgotten about the grace and favor and the blessings of God. And addressing this in the parable that Jesus shared, he said, that's how it is when a person has material riches but is not rich in his relationship with God. The lack of space in this man's life meant he couldn't experience, he couldn't see, he couldn't acknowledge the blessings that God had bestowed upon him. Now, for you and for me, it's probably not crops, particularly in this weather, that are filling the space. But here's some of the things it might be. Maybe it's activities. Maybe it's hobbies. Maybe it's with the kids. Maybe it's doing church stuff. Maybe it's the grandkids. Maybe it's travel. I could keep going on and on and on. I know for me, I've got to be really, really careful. I've got 6 kids that I absolutely adore, and I love spending time with them. But I've got to be really careful that that doesn't replace the time that I spend with Jesus. Because it easily could. It easily could. But like the abundance of crops the rich man had, there's nothing wrong with all of those things. There's nothing wrong with travel or grandkids or kids or anything along those lines, as long as they don't fill up all of the space so that we push Jesus to the side. Jesus should remain where? At the center. So don't push him to the side because you're allowing somebody else or something else to have the space that should be reserved for him. I know, and most of you would know, until the end of last year, I was working at the radio station and then pastoring church, and so I'd be up at 4 o'clock every morning, and I'd go and work there, and then I'd come home and I'd put a different hat on, and then I'd do my church work, and I did that for 8 years or something along those lines, and I loved doing both roles, and I loved serving the kingdom in both areas. But I realized, and I got to a point where I realized that I'd filled up all the space. I'd filled up all the space that I had, and there was no room for anything else. And so, my family is very precious to me, and so I was deliberate about being present, But sometimes actually I was there present physically, but like emotionally and in all other ways I wasn't really there. And my kids would be like, hey, Dad, let's go for a bike ride. Be like, oh, I'm too tired. Hey, Dad, let's go play handball. No, I'm too tired. Hey, Dad, let's do this, let's do that. My common response was, I'm too tired, I'm too exhausted. And it took me getting to that place to realize I'd filled my life to the point where there was no space. I had nothing left to give. I was running on empty. And so something, had to actually change. And, as I kind of reflected, I was like, at the time I thought, well, I'm doing the right thing. I'm serving God in 2 areas. I'm further in the kingdom. I'm doing everything, that I feel like He's asked me to do. And to some degree I was, but I got it to an extreme place where it was unhealthy for me. And like the rich man was doing a good thing. God was blessing his crops, but he got to a place where it was unhealthy. And for me, it was unhealthy physically, to some degree spiritually, because I hadn't left any space. There was no margin in what I was doing and how I was living. No margin for the unexpected. No margin to dream. When you don't have any space, you can't dream with God. And sometimes He just wants you to sit in His presence and dream. God, what have you got for me? Ask that question. Put aside an hour this week. No distractions, nothing going on around you. Sit in His presence. Say, God, what have you got for me? I promise you, He will show you those dreams. Spiritual clutter creates a situation where we think we're doing the right things, where we think we're following Jesus in the right way, but actually what we're doing is creating a clutter that takes us away from Him because we haven't left space or margin. Right, so lack of space. Second one is this, lack of relationship, which really comes, I guess, on the back of that lack of space. But I love how Jesus would always leave space. He absolutely would. No doubt, as His ministry is growing, no doubt as people are chasing after Jesus and they want just a little bit of Him, for Him to pray for them, for Him to, raise someone in their family from the dead. Right through Scripture, you see a common pattern is people are after Jesus. They want a piece of Him. So in His schedule, He's got less and less space. But He is always very, very deliberate when it comes to carving out that space. Despite the importance of His ministry, constantly throughout your Bible and mine, He would create space and come back to spend time with the Father. Luke 5:15. However, He made a practice of withdrawing to remote places in order to pray. What did He want to do? Get away from the clutter, get away from the noise, find a quiet place and spend time with His Father. Great practice for you and for me. Matthew 14:23. After Jesus said goodbye to the people, He went up into the hills by Himself to pray. It was late and He was there alone. Jesus knew the importance of leaving the space when it came to not cluttering up everything. But as much as He knew how important it was to get away from the crowds and to be by himself and to pray and to spend time with the Father, He actually also knew, and maybe even more importantly, that lack of relationship would be an issue. And so He was conscious of that. He was conscious that relationship was so very, very important. Look at this from Mark 6:31. He has this eye-opening interaction with the disciples. Jesus and His followers were in a very busy place. They had a lot of stuff going on. Their schedule was packed. There were so many people that he and his followers didn't even have time to eat. Get a sense of how busy that is. You ever been so busy at work? You're just like, no, I don't have time for lunch. No, I don't have time for a coffee. No, I don't have time for this. But look at what Jesus does. He says to his disciples, come with me. We will go to a quiet place to be alone. There we will get some rest. So the apostles are really busy. Jesus is really busy. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of ministry that they want to do. And by all accounts, they're seeing a lot of fruit from their labors. The Bible makes that very clear. What I find interesting is that Jesus doesn't actually celebrate those achievements. He doesn't get the disciples and pat them on the back and say, well done for the great ministry that you've been doing. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to turn around and I want you to go back out there because there's people that still haven't heard the gospel and I want you to go and share the gospel with them. I want you to introduce them to me so that they can get saved. He doesn't do that because he loves and he cares for the disciples. And he knows that as important as the ministry is, he knows that's not what they need right now. And so he says, come with me. Let's just go and hang out away from the crowds, away from the people. We'll have something to eat and we'll just spend time together. Can you see how a lack of relationship is something that Jesus doesn't want with the disciples? Doesn't matter that there's a whole bunch of things that need to happen. Doesn't matter that there's more ministry to do. Ministry was important to Jesus, yes, but much more important was his relationship with his disciples and his followers. They had to find a way to get away from the clutter, to get away from the noise, to get away from the crowds, to find a place they could spend time together, where they could rest together. Their relationship was much more important than their results. And the same is true for you and me. Your relationship with Jesus is much more important than anything you can do for him. That's what he cares about. Because the danger can be, and this is one I've got to be very careful about, and anybody who's in ministry has to be very careful about. The danger can be we fill up the space with the things of God, but we actually don't have space for God himself. We can fill things up with things like, things that are good, but they're not at the expense where we push God to the side and we don't actually spend that time with him. I put it this way. Religion without relationship is ruinous. Don't just go through religious rituals and religious practices. They have to come out of your walk with Jesus and your relationship with him. So here's some of the things that I wrote. If you're in some form of ministry, if you teach SRE, if you lead a Bible study, if you lead a home group, if you pastor a church, etc., anything along those lines, never let the ministry become more important than the relationship. You should never be too busy furthering the kingdom that you don't have time to be in the presence of the King. I don't know about you, but sometimes I can get so busy that the tendency can be, I don't really have that much time to spend with Jesus. I'll give you a couple of token minutes. He doesn't want tokenism. He wants us to spend time with him. And I had to learn this probably the hard way when we were living in Tanna in Vanuatu. And so you walk everywhere. So I'd walk like 3 or 4 hours to go someplace. And as I was walking, you pass a lot of villages, and we were doing a lot of village ministry in those areas. And so you knew a lot of people that were there. And so you walk for an hour or so and you pass a village and then you see someone that you know there and they're like, because they don't work, they only work in their garden, so they've got a lot of time. But for a task-focused person like me, I'm like, well, I've got to get to this place because I've got something to do. And I had to really learn, because I'd pass a village and someone would say, hey, come and have a story, which just means sit down and have a chat. And I had to learn to go, okay, I'll go and have a talk to this person. And a lot of times, do you know what? I didn't get to the place that I was first going to because I thought I was being distracted, by this conversation that I was having, this unexpected conversation. But I learned in time that the distraction was actually God's plan and the importance of relationship with those that we were working with in that area. So don't ever be too busy. All right, so as we finish this morning, as we draw to a close, I only want those to go as we finish and think a couple of minutes and we're done. Still got a little bit of a way to go. But as we draw to a close this morning, I want to give you very quickly just 2 tools that hopefully can help you clear some spiritual clutter in your life. And maybe these are principles that you can actually share with someone if they're struggling. Because I think they're appropriate for all types of clutter. Obviously, this morning we're looking at spiritual clutter, so I'm going to put it into that context. But anything that we can accumulate and carry with us can actually be something I think that this hopefully is valuable for you. All right, the first of those is to trust the timing. Trust the timing. God's timing is perfect. We don't always agree with God's timing, or maybe that's just me, but his timing is perfect. And if we're clearing the clutter, can I encourage you to only do that according to God's perfect timing? I love the second part of Ecclesiastes 3. It's verse 6. It says, there is a time to keep things and a time to throw things away. There is a time to keep things, but there's also a time to throw things away. Sometimes the Lord actually asks us to hold on to things because they're doing something in us. Sometimes we want to get rid of it. He's saying, no, I'm not going to get rid of that pain because I'm using it to grow you. I'm not going to get rid of that fear or that discomfort or whatever it is because I'm using that to prepare you for the thing that is to come. Now, at that point of time, we might just want to go, God, I'm sick of this. Just take it away. But know that there is always purpose in everything that we are going through. When we try to force things ourselves, we become like the rich man. We take matters into our own hands and out of God's. That's why his timing is perfect, but his timing is so important. It's especially true with our prayers. Sometimes we need to let go of things that we've been praying for because they're actually not from God. They're things that we would like. Imagine the rich man if he was praying for some new barns. Could you imagine that conversation between him and God? Oh, Lord, thank you for all my crops. I can't keep them all. Please bless me with new barns. You ever prayed that kind of prayer? And maybe God's actually saying something else to you. You're praying for new barns, but God's actually saying, you don't need new barns. You just need to be generous with what I have given you. But sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes we need to let go of things that we're praying for because they're not aligned with what God has for us, and they're just creating spiritual clutter because we're holding on to them because we really want them. But sometimes we need to persevere when it comes to prayer. Sometimes we need to push through. Sometimes what we actually need to do is we need to keep praying those faith-filled prayers. When God has spoken to you and has said this, and the time is progressing, and you're thinking, should I just give up on that? If God has spoken that to you and it's a clear promise from him, no, don't give up on it. Keep praying into it. Keep praying into it. Keep praying expectantly. Keep waiting with expectation for what God is going to do as he answers those prayers. Now, I don't have time in it today, but the parable of the weeds, Matthew 13, if you want to do some reading, is all about that. Wait for God's perfect timing before the weeds get taken out and there's space for the wheat to grow. Okay? His timing is perfect. So you've got to trust the timing. Second point for you this morning, hit unsubscribe. I've got several email addresses, a personal one I use for church, and one of them is a Gmail address, and so I have it on my phone. And I was with my kids some time ago, and they saw my phone. They're like, "Dad, you've got like 8,400 unopened emails. You've got to open them and read them." And I'm like, "No, most of it's just junk that I don't need to open or read." They're like, "No, but what if there's something important in there?" And I thought, well, if it's important, I would have opened it. Although, I am a little concerned that maybe I've missed an email in amongst the 8,400 from a bank in Nigeria saying they've put 40 million aside for me and I just need to contact them. I don't know, maybe that's there, I'm not 100% sure. But these are things that I've just accumulated over time. Like I've, done some online shopping somewhere and they say, "Look, subscribe to our newsletter. We'll give you a welcome voucher. You'll get $10 off." "Oh, that's good. I'll save myself $10, so I'll do that." You add your name to this list because you're traveling somewhere and so you want some details about the travel. And you just accumulate, but you never, I don't know if it's just me, but you never actually just get rid of it. You just ignore those emails. And so they just keep building up and piling up and piling up and piling up until you get to the point where there's 8,400 of them that you haven't even opened or looked at and have no need for because it's information that you no longer need. But they're still there. But what I've been doing over the last couple of weeks, and I have found this really healthy. It's been really cathartic. I've been going through and going, "Yeah, I'm not going to buy anything from that shop anymore. Unsubscribe. Take me off your mailing list. Unsubscribe. Take me off this list. Unsubscribe. Take me off that list." I'm down to something like 3,000 unopened emails. And they're probably all from years and years ago, and so I'm not going to worry about them. But do you know what I've actually found? I'm getting less emails in my inbox, and it's fantastic. Now, I don't know what it is, but because I didn't open all the other emails, but there's just something going, there's like kind of like a lightness or a freedom in that. Because I've hit unsubscribe on all this stuff, that I've just been accumulating. And I think for you and for me, maybe there are things that we need to hit unsubscribe on. Maybe there's voices that we used to listen to before, but they've drifted away from where we're at. Hit unsubscribe. Don't listen to those voices anymore. Don't listen to people that are speaking against God's bride. Church is the bride of Christ. Why would you choose to listen to someone who's speaking negatively against his church? Proverbs 18:21 says that our words can bring life or they can bring death. If you've subscribed, in a metaphorical sense, to anything that is bringing death, that is not bringing life, I encourage you to hit unsubscribe on that today. Anything that crowds out the voice of God, anything that draws you away from your walk with Jesus, anything that is a distraction and pushes Jesus to the side, I encourage you to hit unsubscribe today. All right, as we close today, and I promise you we are actually getting to the close, I want to ask you what you value the most. What do you value the most? What is your treasure in life? Now, you've got an answer right now, but that's not the answer. That's the first response that we go to, but this is homework for you. Spend time actually asking yourself, what is your treasure in life? If the answer is a material possession around you, then what tends to happen is that people like that, they embrace the clutter and they say, we need more. We need more of the clutter. But that isn't the best thing for you. That's not God's plan for you. Instead, when I say, what is your treasure in life? The answer should be, doesn't mean it is, because we're all a work in progress. The answer should be my relationship with Jesus. That should be what is the most valuable, treasured thing in your life. Can I be open and honest? Sometimes when I ask myself that question, sometimes my answer is my family. Now, should I treasure my family? Absolutely. Is my family important to me? Absolutely. Is it the most important thing? No, it sits at number 2. My relationship with Jesus has to be the most valuable thing. Because when we get to that place, do you know what? We hold the things of this world lightly. Whether we have a lot, whether we have a little, it doesn't matter. We hold them lightly. When Jesus is at the center, we can embrace the words that Paul wrote in Philippians 3:8. Here's what he says. Now I think that all things are worth nothing compared with the greatness of knowing Jesus Christ my Lord. All things are worth nothing when you compare them to relationship with Jesus. Your 7-bedroom house on the water with your boat and your jet ski means nothing compared to knowing Jesus. He then goes on to say, because of Christ, I lost all these things, and now I know that they are all worthless trash. All I want now is Christ. I wonder today if we can say the same thing. I wonder if honestly we can say, all I want is Jesus. Paul's encounter with Jesus changed his priorities. It changed what was important to him. No longer did he hold on to his clutter. No longer did it draw him away from God. When he had that encounter, when he cleared the clutter, Paul found freedom from his past, he found purpose in his present, and he found eternity in Jesus. How did he do it? He got rid of all the spiritual clutter that he was carrying. And can we agree? He had a bunch of it. He had a bunch. Persecuting Christians, going out and killing them. He had a bunch. But he was able to free himself from that and become the new man that you and I read about. Paul discovered what was really valuable when he cleared the clutter. My hope is for you and for me that we can do likewise.